As a ritual we go through after elections like last night's, we face up to a divided government. We all say, hell, here's a chance for the two parties to work together and show the American people that Washington can work and bipartisanship can succeed. But that kind of thinking completely ignores what has happened in Washington over the course of the last few years and what unfolded on Election Day yesterday. So just to refresh, okay, after Republicans took over the House in the 2010 midterms, we saw the least productive Congress ever, followed by the current Congress, which is on track to be even less productive. And it's not just because Republicans controlled the House and Democrats controlled the Senate. There are major bills that passed the Senate with bipartisan support and could have passed the House the very next day. Most notably, as I was just talking about, comprehensive immigration reform, which passed the Senate last year 68-32, which in the environment in which we live is amazing. And ENDA, that's the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, which the Senate also passed last year by a 64-32 vote, almost 2/3 to 1/3. And instead of choosing to pass these broadly popular pieces of legislation, bipartisan, and show up at a bill signing ceremony and share the credit, John Boehner, Republican Speaker of the House, made a calculation. The best thing to do was to do nothing. Boehner did not allow comprehensive immigration reform or ENDA to come to a vote in the House because Boehner thought that doing so would alienate his base and give the president a big political victory. Well, let's not forget, Boehner and Republicans actually shut down the government little more than a year ago. But last night, after all this, the American people gave John Boehner and the Republicans at least 14 more members of the House, making the GOP caucus its largest since 1928, according to NBC News projections. So, after watching all of this unfold, why, in God's name, would Speaker Boehner have any incentive to do anything other than what he's been doing? Or Senator Mitch McConnell, for that matter. This is the new logic of obstruction. In the partisan polarized era we live in now, it is in the self-interest of political parties not to work together. It is in their electoral self-interest, and we saw that borne out last night. Joining me now, Thomas SCHALLER, professor of political science at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, also author of The Stronghold and Whistling Past Dixie. All right, Tom, what do you think of that theory?
Well, I think it's essentially correct. We keep hearing all the time. I have a quote in the new book about David Broder saying that if Republicans don't prove that they could govern when they're in the minority, they'll never be given the reins of power in the House. He wrote that in 1992. 2 years later, Newt Gingrich is running the House. And of course, there was plenty of obstruction in the 90s, even though Clinton and the Republicans in Congress were able to get some things done. And I think the modus operandi right now is to never support the opposing party, to vote against the other party, to try to block the president if the Democrats have the White House and vice versa. And I think that's a lesson that was learned very hard way by people like Hillary Clinton and John Kerry, who voted for the Iraq War, didn't get any credit for that vote and took a lot of blame. And I think the Republicans know this better than the Democrats. If you vote with the president and things go right, for the most part, they're not going to go down. Voters aren't going to go down through the roll call and say, oh, that Republican senator, that Republican House member, he did support the president. No, the president's going to get the lion's share of the credit. And that's true, I think, for either party in the White House. But if things go wrong, the president's going to immediately turn and say, oh, Hillary Clinton, she voted for the war.
Right. And so what you have, I mean, Mitch McConnell, I think, has been a kind of entrepreneur in this space, in obstruction, in understanding the political dynamics of this partisan era. Again, I'm separating this from political logic from the moral logic, which I actually think is odious because there are millions of people whose lives are on the line in all of these and deserve full dignity. But separating that out for a moment, Mitch McConnell had this quote early on when he said, we worked very hard to keep our fingerprints off any bill because we didn't want anyone to think, as soon as they heard bipartisan, like it was okay, there was no debate. We wanted to heighten the contradictions at all times. And I just failed to see why the logic shifts from that 2 days ago to some new logic today.
No, and look at all the stories we've read in the last 2 years about Republicans in the House or senators in the minority are putting up another bill or trying to attach a rider to some piece of legislation to repeal Obamacare. Why are they doing that? They know that even if they pass it through the House, which they have many times, it won't get past Senator Harry Reid. And even if they abduct him and put him in a white van down by the river or something and push it through the Senate somehow, it's not going to pass President Obama's desk, right? So why are they doing that? And the answer, I think, Chris, and as I argue in the book, is that it signals very strongly that they don't want to do things. I mean, John Boehner said very clearly, we should be judged not by the laws that we pass, but the laws that we don't pass, the laws that we block. And there's a philosophical reason for that, and there's an asymmetry between the two parties. The Republicans, whatever you think about them, they're not necessarily making bad strategic choices here, right? They're the party that wants the government to be smaller and to move slower. And they are in the perch, the Congress, and especially in the House, to execute exactly that strategy. The presidency, from the time of Hamilton's conceit in the Federalist Papers to more common and current political writers like my colleague Stephen Skowronek at Harvard, this is the energy of office. This is the office that breaks the equilibrium in politics. Only when everything's in line. President Obama had a majority say in his first 2 years. It's still hard to break the equilibrium even with the presidency. But what you really want to do with the Congress is stop, stall, dilute, block, and maybe even repeal. And the Republicans, the modern Republican Party, is perfectly situated to do that.
Finally, give us a sense of the historic nature of this 250 votes in the House, because I think people, the 20th century was so defined by a Democratic Congress from the New Deal basically through the '94 election. We look like we might be entering an era where the norm is a big House Republican majority.
Not only that, we have a big House Republican majority in the Senate, Chris. I looked at when the Republicans took over the Senate in the start of the Eisenhower administration, at the start of the Reagan administration, and when they recaptured it in 2002 after the Jeffords switch. They went from senators in the Republican caucus who formerly served in the House from 20%, 1 out of 5 in the 50s, to 32%, about 1 out of 3 in the 1980s under Reagan, to now 50%. And we have Cory Gardner coming in.
Right, so they're all coming through the House. The House is the birthplace and the kind of cauldron of Republican politics.
And that's where you learn your politics. Look where Ted Cruz looked for support. He went to the House, right? So we've Houseified the Senate, and we shouldn't be surprised that we see a House-style politics in the saucer that's supposed to cool the cup. Moving forward, we're going to have a very House-like Senate majority in the next Congress.
Thomas Schaller, thank you very much. All right, with all of the election results we had to bring you last night, some of the races I'd put into the, what's the technical term? Hot mess category, went underreported. Never fear, all in viewer. We will fill you in next.